Why living near your children in old age could be the biggest mistake of your life. Living alone. Introduction. As people age, the question of whether to live close to their children or maintain independence becomes one of the most significant choices they face. The notion of staying near family, particularly children and grandchildren, is deeply ingrained in our cultural values. It promises emotional support, a sense of belonging, and practical assistance as health inevitably declines. Many older adults, like Mrs. Maria, have romanticized ideas of being surrounded by their children, playing an active role in their grandchildren's lives, and enjoying a shared family life that seems to provide all the ingredients for happiness. But what happens when that decision comes with unexpected burdens? What if, instead of leading to joy, living near your children leads to a life where personal independence erodes, routines become exhausting, and individual identity is subsumed under the weight of family obligations? For many older adults, this seemingly idyllic family setup might actually be the biggest mistake of their later years. In this essay, we will explore the reasons why living close to your children might not be the golden answer to aging that it appears to be. By sharing insights and experiences from those like Mrs. Maria, who chose to live near their families only to later question that choice, we'll see why maintaining independence could be the key to a fulfilling and happy old age. 1. The allure of family closeness in old age. The pull toward family closeness in old age is strong. After all, what could be more comforting than spending your later years in the embrace of loved ones? Mrs. Maria, a 72-year-old widow, certainly believed this was the ideal solution after the passing of her husband. The decision to move in with her daughter, Rachel, and her family seemed like the perfect way to fill the void in her life. After all, she adored her grandchildren and looked forward to being part of their daily lives. Mrs. Maria imagined waking up every morning to the laughter of children, preparing meals for them, and sharing in their growing-up years. In the beginning, the arrangement seemed to work beautifully. Mrs. Maria's presence in the household was met with gratitude and affection. Her grandchildren loved having their grandmother around, and she felt needed again. There was joy in preparing meals, helping with schoolwork, and sharing bedtime stories. She enjoyed a sense of purpose, which had diminished after her husband's passing. For the first few months, it appeared as though Mrs. Maria had made the right decision. She was surrounded by the warmth of family, and the daily bustle made her feel alive. However, as time went on, Mrs. Maria began to realize that the situation wasn't as perfect as she had initially thought. The demands on her time and energy started to increase. What began as occasional help soon turned into a daily routine of childcare, cooking, and housekeeping. Instead of the relaxing and enjoyable life she had envisioned, Mrs. Maria found herself increasingly worn out. She began to feel more like a live-in caregiver than a beloved grandmother. The idyllic life she had hoped for was starting to feel more like a burden. 2. The gradual loss of independence. Mrs. Maria's story is far from unique. Many older adults who move in with their children or live close by find themselves slowly losing their independence. At first, the small requests for help seem reasonable. But over time, these requests grow into expectations, and soon the older adult's life revolves around the needs of their family rather than their own desires. Mrs. Maria, who once took pleasure in reading, gardening, and meeting friends, now had little time for herself. Her days were consumed with childcare, cooking meals, and helping out with household chores. The freedom she had cherished for so long was slowly slipping away. Psychologist Erik Erikson's theory of psychosocial development highlights the importance of autonomy in old age. When older adults lose control over their own lives, it can lead to a sense of despair and loss of identity. This was precisely what was happening to Mrs. Maria. She had moved in with her daughter with the best of intentions, but over time, she began to feel trapped by the demands of family life. She found herself wondering if she had made a mistake by giving up her independence. As Mrs. Maria's responsibilities increased, so did her sense of fatigue. She no longer had the energy to engage in activities she once loved. The quiet moments she used to spend with a good book or enjoying a walk in the park became few and far between. Philosopher Epicurus famously said, "It is not that we have little time, but that we waste a lot of it." Mrs. Maria's time was no longer her own. It was consumed by the needs of others, and she felt her life slowly shrinking around her. 3. The emotional and physical toll. The emotional and physical toll of living near children and becoming their primary support system can be devastating. Mrs. Maria, like many older adults, began to experience the effects of what some psychologists call the caregiver's burden. Although she loved her grandchildren dearly, the constant demands on her time and energy were wearing her down. She started to feel overwhelmed by the daily tasks, and her health began to decline. The joy she had initially felt was now overshadowed by exhaustion and a sense of duty that was becoming harder to bear. Dr. Antonio Guaro coined the term slave grandmother syndrome to describe the emotional and physical burden many grandmothers experience when they take on unpaid caregiving roles for their grandchildren. This syndrome reflects the emotional roller coaster that grandmothers often find themselves on, balancing their love for their grandchildren with the overwhelming responsibilities that come with caring for them full-time. Mrs. Maria, like many other grandmothers, did not initially recognize the toll this was taking on her health and well-being. She told herself that it was her duty to help her family, but deep down, she felt increasingly unhappy. This burden is not unique to grandmothers. Older adults who become primary caregivers for their grandchildren often find themselves dealing with increased stress, fatigue, and even depression. Studies have shown that older adults in caregiving roles are at higher risk for mental health issues, including anxiety and depression. The physical strain of caregiving can also exacerbate existing health problems. Mrs. Maria, once vibrant and full of energy, now found herself struggling with chronic fatigue and muscle aches. Her once active social life had all but disappeared, replaced by a never-ending list of family responsibilities. 4. The importance of personal boundaries. One of the most significant challenges of living near children in old age is maintaining personal boundaries. Without clear boundaries, the line between helping and becoming overwhelmed can blur very quickly. Mrs. Maria's situation is a perfect example of how family expectations can grow over time, eventually leading to a loss of personal space and autonomy. Initially, her daughter, Rachel, was grateful for her help, but as the months went by, Rachel started to expect more and more from her mother. What began as occasional assistance turned into a daily obligation, and Mrs. Maria's role in the household expanded to the point where she no longer had control over her own time. This erosion of boundaries can lead to feelings of resentment and frustration. Mrs. Maria began to feel invisible in her daughter's household. Her opinions were often disregarded, and she felt as though she was simply a cog in the family machine. This dynamic can be incredibly damaging to an older adult's sense of self-worth and identity. Erik Erikson's theory emphasizes the importance of maintaining autonomy and personal identity in old age. When older adults lose control over their own lives, they are at risk of experiencing an identity crisis, which can lead to feelings of despair and hopelessness. For Mrs. Maria, the realization that she was losing her independence was a turning point. She began to question whether moving in with her daughter had been the right decision. She loved her family dearly, but she also missed the freedom to live life on her own terms. She started to feel trapped by the very relationships she had once cherished. 5. Rediscovering independence. A turning point. Thankfully for Mrs. Maria, she had a close friend, Linda, who noticed the changes in her. Linda had gone through a similar experience and understood the emotional toll that living with children could take. One day, during a visit, Linda sat down with Mrs. Maria and asked her how she was truly feeling. At first, Mrs. Maria was hesitant to admit her feelings of exhaustion and frustration. She felt guilty for feeling this way, knowing how much her daughter relied on her. But Linda encouraged her to be honest, and slowly Mrs. Maria began to open up. Linda shared her own story of moving out of her daughter's house after realizing that she needed to reclaim her independence. She explained how difficult the decision had been, but how it had ultimately transformed her life for the better. Linda told Mrs. Maria, "You can still be a loving mother and grandmother while living your own life. In fact, you'll be a better one if you're happy and fulfilled." Inspired by Linda's words, Mrs. Maria began to take small steps toward regaining her independence. She started by taking daily walks, something she hadn't done in months. Then, she signed up for a painting class at the local community center, a hobby she had once loved but had abandoned after moving in with her daughter. These small acts of reclaiming her time and space began to make a significant difference in Mrs. Maria's well-being. She felt more energized, more connected to herself, and more capable of enjoying the time she spent with her family. 6. The joys of living alone, a new beginning. Living alone in old age can offer a surprising number of benefits. For Mrs. Maria, moving into her own apartment after living with her daughter was a life-changing decision. While it was initially difficult to leave the comfort and familiarity of her daughter's home, she soon realized that living alone gave her the freedom she desperately needed. She was able to structure her days according to her own desires, pursue her hobbies, and reconnect with friends she had lost touch with. Living independently allowed Mrs. Maria to rediscover her sense of self. She no longer felt overwhelmed by the demands of family life, and she could prioritize her own needs and interests. Studies show that older adults who live independently report higher levels of life satisfaction and mental well-being. By regaining control over her own life, Mrs. Maria felt more fulfilled and happier than she had in years. Her newfound independence didn't mean she cut ties with her family. In fact, her relationships with her daughter and grandchildren improved. By setting boundaries and prioritizing her own well-being, Mrs. Maria was able to be more present and engaged when she did spend time with them. The time she spent with her family became more meaningful, and she no longer felt resentful or overburdened. Mrs. Maria had found a balance between family and independence that allowed her to live her best life. 7. Navigating guilt and family expectations. One of the biggest challenges older adults face when seeking independence is the guilt that comes with stepping away from family responsibilities. Mrs. Maria worried about how her daughter would react to her decision to move out. She didn't want Rachel to feel abandoned or hurt, but she also knew that staying in the current situation was not sustainable for her own well-being. When Mrs. Maria finally sat down to talk with her daughter, the conversation was emotional but necessary. Rachel was initially surprised and upset, but as Mrs. Maria explained her feelings, Rachel began to understand. She realized that her mother wasn't abandoning the family, but simply taking care of herself. Over time, Rachel came to appreciate the positive changes in her mother and supported her decision to live independently. This conversation was a turning point for both mother and daughter. It opened the door to honest communication about boundaries, expectations, and personal needs. Mrs. Maria's decision to prioritize her own well-being set an important example for her daughter, teaching her the value of self-care and personal fulfillment. By making this courageous choice, Mrs. Maria not only improved her own life, but also strengthened her family relationships. 8. Conclusion. Embracing independence in old age. In conclusion, while living near your children in old age might seem like the ideal solution, it can come with significant challenges that impact your personal freedom, emotional health, and overall happiness. Mrs. Maria's journey from living with her daughter to reclaiming her independence illustrates the importance of setting boundaries and prioritizing self-care as we age. By choosing to live independently, Mrs. Maria was able to regain control over her life, rediscover her passions, and improve her relationships with her family. Living alone in old age offers many benefits, from maintaining autonomy to improving mental and physical health. It allows older adults to continue growing, learning, and living life on their own terms. For Mrs. Maria, the decision to move out of her daughter's home was not just about reclaiming independence, it was about reclaiming her sense of self. Ultimately, the key to happiness in old age lies in finding the right balance between family and independence. By setting healthy boundaries and prioritizing personal fulfillment, older adults can maintain close, loving relationships with their families while also living lives that are rich, meaningful, and full of joy. Thank you so much for watching and for joining me on this journey to explore the importance of embracing independence in old age. I hope this video has provided valuable insights and inspiration for those of you facing similar decisions. Remember, finding balance between family and personal independence is key to a fulfilling life as we age. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss any of our future content. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Take care, and until next time.